Are you talking to yourself? I remember when I was little, we used to watch the other kids, and if they appeared like they were talking to themselves, we would make fun of them, right? There are people who, even as adults, have this habit of verbally, like audibly talking to themselves, and you can see them mouthing stuff and saying things to themselves. And we tend to think that it's funny, but the reality of it is that we all talk to ourselves. The question is, how are we talking to ourselves? What are we saying to ourselves? Are we using those conversations in the most productive way possible, or are we letting those conversations just be automatic and just drift in and out of our minds without us questioning it or thinking about it? See, the thing is, we tend to be a lot more aware of what other people say to us than what we say to ourselves. But it is that inner conversation that actually initiates and that determines the direction in which we take the information that we receive. It's that internal conversation that makes the most impactful difference in the way we lead our lives and in the way we connect with others. So, on this episode of Sincerely Speaking, we're going to talk about talking to yourself. How do you do it? Why do you do it? And how can we make those conversations more productive? Are you ready? Let's go.
Hi, I am Marcia Amaro, self-leadership coach, communication expert, and life integration strategist. Now, all of that means that I help creative, multi-passionate, amazing, positive, contribution-driven people like you discover and rediscover their callings and their purpose, live lives that are meaningful, purposeful, and powerful, and go forward with boldness and with confidence to create the lives, the business, the relationships, and everything that they want in their lives. So if you're ready for every part of your life to come together and move towards unparalleled success, you're in the right place. Welcome to Sincerely Speaking.
So there is this understanding that has taken place, or that has actually grown in the last decade or so, maybe a couple of decades, that we are essentially programmed, right? We have come to equate our brains with computers. Funny that our brains came first. But anyway, we have come to understand a lot about the way our own brain works as we explore this whole idea of creating computing systems and programmings and now artificial intelligence and all these things. And as we explore these ideas, we have come to a deeper understanding of how our own brain works. And we have come to see, and when I say we, I mean generally as as a people, right? As a species, we have come to understand that our brains operate through a series of programs, right? You can call it neural pathways. You can get really scientific and talk about just myelination and all these other technical terms that we are not going to get into. But the reality of it is that our brains operate essentially based on programs. And those programs start being fed and infused and inputted into our brains when we are born. The second we get out of, in fact, depending on the school that you buy into, I believe that your programming begins even before you're born, right? Like the voices that you hear, the way that your gestational period is taken care of. Like there's a lot of elements that come into it, and that's a whole nature nurture conversation that we can have at another time. But whether you believe that it starts before you're born or the moment you're born, the reality is, and the fact is, that we are understanding more and more and more the fact that we are programmed, and that that programming begins the second our senses are exposed, right? So the moment you are able to take in any kind of sensorial information, you are starting to be programmed in one way or another, right? Now, some of us are luckier than others in that the programming we receive from our parents and from our immediate environment is generally pretty okay, pretty good, right? But there have been statistics that say that even in the most positive households, about 60 to 80% of the messages we receive are negative anyway, right? And we're going to talk more about how that affects us in a minute. But the reality of it is that we are not in control at the beginning of our life of the messages that we receive, the programming that is installed, and the way in which we are taught to view ourselves, view the world, and view others, right? That is all taken in from people and situations and the environment around us. So environment is really important. But the point is that our brains operate through a series of programs. Now, to be fair, programs are essential. Programs are important. And here's why. Imagine if, like, just sit for a second and try to take in as much of your environment as possible. Talking about environment, right? Try to take in as much as you can. Like try to see everything, try to hear everything, try to sense everything with your skin, try to notice the smells, try to taste the air, try to take in as many different sensory clues as you can. And you're going to notice that within a second, you're going to be like, no, wait, I can't. I can't take it all in. It's too much. You're going to get overloaded and overwhelmed, even if you don't suffer from any kind of sensory issues, right? Where you're just overloaded by sensory cues. So even for those of us who don't struggle with taking in sensory input, there's so much, sorry about that, there's so much around us that it would be impossible for our brains to process every little detail and every little thing that happens around us. It's too much. So programs, one of the things that they do is help our brains minimize what they have to pay attention to and be able to make decisions and get us moving and get us going through life in as an automatic way as possible. Because if we didn't do that, then we would be overloaded by all the information that we're trying to take in. And it would be really hard for our brains to process this information and to get us moving forward, right? We would be just overwhelmed by all the information that's around us. So at any given time, our brain uses the programming that has been installed in order to help it figure out what to focus on, in order to help it decide where its attention and focus gets to go so that it is not as overloaded or as overwhelmed as it might have been if it was trying to take everything in. Makes sense? So programs are important, but it's also important to realize that we do operate based on programs and that not all of those programs have given us the right information or are not useful throughout the entirety of our lives or might not be the best programs to use, even though they're the programs that pop up, right? So we get to start being more conscious of some of those programs if we are going to work on elevating our lives and elevating the way we approach the things that we're doing and the way that we operate and the things that we do, right? So it's important to understand the programs. I'm reminded right now, for example, as I'm talking about this, of a story that Robert Cialdini includes in his book Influence, which if you haven't read, you should. But is it Influence as well? Yeah, I think it's Influence. Anyway, and he talks about how there's this I want to say it's turkeys. There's this bird, right? That its instinct to feed its babies is triggered by a chirp chirp sound that the babies make. Now, the natural enemy of this bird is a mole rat. And they took a stuffed mole rat and they put a disc in it or a recording device inside of it so that it made the chirp 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 sound of the baby chick, of the baby bird. And the mom fed that enemy because it made the chirp chirp sound, right? But if a baby didn't make the chirp chirp sound for whatever reason, it wasn't fed and it would be left to die. And it might even be attacked as seen as enemy, right? So they were talking about how the instinct there is based on that trigger, on that program. And most of the time, it serves the mama bear well because just hearing the chirp chirp, she knows she gets to go feed her babies, right? But there are circumstances, and of course, these were orchestrated circumstances by human beings, but under those specific circumstances, that instinct didn't serve her very well, right? So, in that same way, our programming, most of it, serves us well most of the time. But there might be instances in which it doesn't, in which those programs are not leading us to the right conclusions or not leading us to the right actions. So it's important to start becoming aware of those programmings that operate within us. And we're going to talk in a little bit about how do we start becoming aware of those programs? How do we recognize them? How do we get to the bottom of what they are and how do we start changing them a little bit? But it's important to understand that that is the first level of being aware, right? Is understanding that we operate based on programs and that those programs were fed to us by our environments, circumstances, and the people around us before we were at a stage in our development where we could do anything about it, right? So It's a little unfair to think about it, but at the same time, it leads us into a conversation of possibility, right? But everything that is the foundation of our programming came to us from people outside of us and for some from circumstances outside of us at a time when we were not able to do anything about it, right? And the reason why it's important to understand that now is because if we just continue to operate on automatic based on those programs that we didn't particularly choose and that we had no say in, then we are allowing ourselves to be controlled and our lives to be dictated by outside forces that are no longer even part of who we are, right? Which takes us to the second thing that I want to mention, which is what Napoleon Hill calls the hypnotic rhythm. Most of us operate under this hypnotic rhythm. We get up, we go through our morning routine, we get in our car, we drive to work, we do the things we need to do at work, we drive back, we come home, we fix dinner, we sit down, we eat, we maybe read or watch some TV, and then doze off until we go to sleep, right? So most of us operate on this rhythm that is hypnotic to the level that very often, if you ask someone at lunch what they had for breakfast, they're going to have a hard time telling you. Most of us drive from our home to our job in such an automatic state that we get to work and we can't recall how we got to work, right? We can't consciously think of what it is that we did to get from home to work. We operate in such a hypnotic rhythm that we are just automatically going through the motions, doing the things, our days leaving, right? One right after the other. We're flipping the pages on the calendar and we're not even aware of what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, right? And that is what Napoleon Hill calls the hypnotic rhythm. We're operating at such an automatic level that it's almost like we have a puppeteer guiding us, right? We're almost not even consciously taking steps towards whatever it is that we're going to do. We're just automatically going through the motions. Now, don't get me wrong, there are habits that are important, and the more productive habits we have in place, the easier it is for us to stay on track with the goals and the things that we want to do, because the less we have to put conscious effort into thinking about what we're going to do next, the easier it is for us to get through it, right? The difference, though, is in the level of, you know what? The difference here, though, is in the fact that when we are captivated in this hypnotic rhythm, it's like when we watch people be hypnotized, right? They're not aware of what they're doing. They're not consciously choosing the way they move. They are not selecting the consequences or the results of what it is that they're doing. So in that same way, when we are allowing ourselves to operate in this hypnotic rhythm without being aware that that's what we're doing, without choosing the habits that we do fall into rhythm with, and without being deliberate about the things that we allow to dictate how we operate in our lives, then we are allowing just the default settings to set in. We're allowing just other things and circumstances to decide for us where we get to go and what we get to do. So it's important to understand that the bulk of our lives, we're operating based on programs that we didn't choose and operating under a hypnotic rhythm that we're not really aware of. In fact, it is the National Science Foundation sent out these statistics that about 95% of the thoughts we have on a day-to-day basis are repetitive. And not only that, 80% of our thoughts are negative, right? So if the 95% of the things we're thinking are repetitive thoughts, things we think at time and time and time and time again, we become numb to them. We don't really recognize that we're thinking them because they're repetitive. They're happening over and over and over and over again. So we stop ourselves from driving ourselves crazy, so to speak, by not paying too much attention to those repetitive thoughts. And then on top of that, 80% are negative. So we are on this record that's playing over and over and over again in our mind, reminding us repetitively of negative things that we don't really need and that don't serve us in any way, shape, or form. So I'm saying all of this to accentuate and to get us to understand how important, how imperative it is for us to actually take the time to think about what we're thinking, to be conscious about the things we tell ourselves and the conversations we're having with ourselves. Because after all those thoughts, all those internal processes that we're going through are conversations we're having with ourselves. They are dialogue that we're having with our inner self, with our brain, with our mind, with the way we operate, right? And so it's important to start bringing awareness to all of these thoughts, all of these conversations that we're having that are happening on automatic, that we're not really aware of, and that are dictating how we face the world and how we interact with the world around us, that are determining our state of mind, our attitude, our approach to life on a day-to-day basis, and that are limiting the way we operate on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis, how we interact with ourselves and with the world around us. All of this is determined in large part by this unconscious programming and this hypnotic rhythm. So it is time to start shifting the way we talk to ourselves. It's time to be more deliberate about the way we talk to ourselves and the things we say to ourselves when we talk to ourselves. Now, the utmost Bible, the ultimate book on this whole concept of talking to yourself was written by Dr. Shad Helmstetter, and it's actually called What to Say When You Talk to Yourself. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Helmstetter, and a lot of the things that I've learned about self-talk and about the way we communicate internally came from him, that conversation that I had with him and his books. So I encourage you to go read them. But one of the things that I want to start with today actually came from Michael Strassner, who is a leadership coach. And he has these programs that he walks people through to elevate and activate their leadership. And one of the things that he talks about is that we live in the drift, right? And the drift basically summarizes everything we've talked about, is when you're allowing circumstances and habitual thoughts and this hypnotic rhythm and all these things outside of you, these programs that you did not pick, to dictate how you move, where you go, and what you do. So you're like drifting in a river. Imagine getting in a river and just laying down to float and just allowing yourself to go in the way the current takes you, in the direction the current takes you. I think it's even more effective to think about the ocean. If you've ever been to the beach, like the ocean, and just floating on the beach, it can get kind of scary at times because you could literally float out into the sea or the ocean and not even know it if you're not paying attention, because it will move you subtly. It's not like a river, which is a lot more I don't know, you can feel it more at times, I guess. And I guess it depends on, anyway, the point is that if you are drifting and you're in the ocean, you have no say of where you go. The current is going to take you and it's going to move you whichever way it wants, right? So that's the image here of being in the drift. And most of us, unfortunately, live in the drift, just letting ourselves be swayed by circumstances, by what's happening, by other people, by the programming that we received before we were conscious of it, by all these things. And then he paints this picture, Michael Strassner, of how do you get out of the drift? And he makes it sound so simple, but I'm going to break it down for you. And what he says is, if you're drifting in a river and you don't want to drift anymore, what do you need to do? You need to stand. The moment you stand, the drift can no longer take you. It might want to move you a little bit. It might want to trip you over. But as long as you're standing, you're not being dragged by the drift. You're not being moved back and forth in the direction of the current, right? So the same thing goes with your mind and with the way that your programming operates and getting out of the hypnotic rhythm and that drift, right? You need to stand. And how do you stand? By stopping and paying attention. Right. And I think that that is one of the key elements of talking to yourself, is your ability to stop yourself and take a close look. Right. It's like if you're driving and you're suddenly understanding that you're lost, but you just keep driving aimlessly, that's going to make things harder. Right. But if you stop, if you pull over and you stop and you take stock of, okay, wait, where did I start? Where am I going? Can I figure out where I'm at right now? And then go from there, then that is going to make things different, right? It's going to shift things and help you make better decisions and move forward in a more productive way. So it's the same thing when it comes to your thoughts and your mind and the way your brain operates. You need to stop. And that is the first thing. You need to stand. And the first thing, the first element of talking to yourself is to stop and really pay attention and become aware of what you're saying to yourself. Pay close attention to your thoughts. Make a deliberate effort to be more aware of what you're saying to yourself when you're saying this, what triggers you saying that, what thoughts you're allowing room in your mind, and why, and what it is that you're doing on a day-to-day basis that keeps you moving in the same direction based on your programming, based on your thoughts, right? And remember when I told you that we're going to take a closer look at where the programming comes from and what to do? When you stop and you take a stand, it's not just enough to notice what the thought is. I mean, that's a great first step. Like if you're suddenly feeling run down, you're suddenly feeling overwhelmed, or you're suddenly feeling like you are sad or depressed or down, stop and ask yourself, what am I thinking right now that has me feeling this way? What am I thinking right now that has me in this experience, right? Or believing this thing or thinking this thing? What is it specifically that I'm thinking? And then take a moment to start thinking about when was the first time that you can consciously remember feeling or thinking that, right? What was happening around you that first time that you can consciously remember thinking or feeling that? And it might take you a little bit of time and it might be painful to think about it, but it's important to do it. And once you realize when was the first time, and it was probably before you were 7 years old, so it might take you a little bit of processing. But once you're able to identify when you started feeling that way, or when you can consciously remember feeling or thinking that, and when you can start identifying what was happening around you, what was in the environment, when you started thinking and feeling that way, you are 100% closer to identifying the source of that program. And once you can identify it, once you can point to it, you have the ability to transform it. Because guess what? Once you start identifying where that came from, you can start identifying whether, first of all, what you remember is true, right? Because very often our brain makes up stories just to help us process and to help us survive and to help us move forward that are not necessarily the case, right? Like when I was 13, my baby sister was born. And at one point, I was playing with her, whatever. And then I went to put her down, but she didn't bend her knees the way I expected her to. And when I put her down, her face actually hit the floor. Like she hit her mouth against the floor. And my dad turned and lost it. He like yelled at me and told me all these things. And anyway, I ran into my room. And my process at that moment was, see, I can't do anything right. I can't do anything right. I can't even take care of my baby sister right. I'm going to harm everybody that's close to me because I can't do this. I can't do anything right. Right. And ever since then, the I can't do this became a very present thought in my mind, became something I told myself all the time. And then I started to think about that experience. That was the first conscious memory I had of that. And then that triggered more memories of even younger times when similar situations happened where I came to the same conclusion that I can't do this. And then I started to realize, but wait a minute, you did do similar things later, or you did do things that were even harder than that, or you've done a bunch of things that prove that you can do that, right? Like I couldn't put my baby sister down at the time properly for whatever reason. I couldn't tell you exactly what happened really, but I have two kids and they survived. They're 18 and 13 and they're still around. So I was able to understand that belief, that thought was not true. And then I was able to change it using the experiences that I've had since that moment, right? So that's how you start changing your programs, is by stopping, taking a stand, paying close attention to what they are, asking yourself, when was the first time you can consciously remember thinking or feeling that? And then finding evidence to prove to yourself that that's not true, that there's other possibilities, right? That you've done things differently. So that awareness is the first piece. The second thing, and I kind of hinted at that already, is to stop believing everything you think. Question all your thoughts, right? When you have a thought of, this is impossible. Wait. First of all, is anything really impossible? Second of all, what makes me think that it's impossible? Where did that thought come from? And then can I find evidence to prove, to show me, either in my own life or in someone else's life, that it is in fact possible, right? And then how can I start shifting that perspective, right? So if I say to myself, I can't do this, I can, one of the things that people do, and I'm going to, this is like a little parenthesis, right? But one of the things that people do that I think the personal development industry and the high performance industry and all these wonderful gurus who have a lot of great things to say, but one of the things that I think they have done that have tripped us up and that have messed us up terribly is talking about reframing without really giving us guidelines for the reframing, right? And one of the guidelines that I think we should add to this idea of reframing, I think reframing works. I think reframing is important. What I just said about taking a stand is a form of reframing, right? But one of the things that they don't tell us is that reframing from one extreme to the other is just as bad as staying in the prior frame, right? As staying in the prior belief. So if I go from I can't do anything right and I try to go to I can do everything right, my brain is quickly going to find evidence that I cannot do everything right. Right? So it's going to be really, really hard for me to move from this extreme to the next because I don't have any proof for this one. That's why I've been believing this one because all my proof is this one. And the very second, the smallest thing happens that shows that this side, this extreme side that I'm trying to move myself into is not true, I'm going to double down on my belief of the previous one, right? So if I go from, I can't do anything right to I can do everything right. The second something doesn't go right, I'm going to double down on, yeah, see, I really can't do anything right. I just suck. I'm the worst. And I'm just going to double down on that. But the key here is to question that thought, right? Stop believing it. Look at it and say, okay, is it really true that I can't do anything right? And find the evidence that I have done some things right. So it can't be true, right? If I've done at least one thing right, then that statement that I can't do anything right is by default false. Then what is the next step? I can do some things right. I can do some things right. And the next one, if I can learn to do some things right, I can learn to do new things right. And if I can learn to do new things right, then I can do this thing that I'm trying to do right. Get it? So it's the progressive steps. And it's also being able to not stay in just the next best step, right? Just keep going, keep gradually growing, but don't try to jump from A to Z because your brain is going to fight you. And it's going to be really easy for your brain to find evidence that A was the right answer. And it's going to double down. It's going to buckle up on there and it's not going to let you get out of there. It's going to be so stubborn to get out of there. So don't try to make the leap from A to Z, but question all your thoughts, especially the ones that don't serve you, especially the ones that make you feel rotten, especially the ones that are not helping you move forward, and stop believing all your thoughts. And then finally, ask yourself better questions. I am a firm believer in the fact that questions and the questions we ask ourselves are our strongest, most important tool. If we can learn to use questions in our benefit and for our growth, then we are going to be leaps and bounds ahead of the game. Because questions, your questions, the quality of your questions determines the quality of the results that you get. I am convinced of that. There's actually a book called Change Your Questions, Change Your Life, which changed my life. And I recommend it. I can't remember the name of the author off the top of my head. You know, when you draw a blank sometimes, that's what's happening right now. But Change Your Questions, Change Your Life. Look it up. And it's a great book and it will help you start changing the questions that you tell yourself. And one of the things that I learned from that book that I hadn't been aware of before is that a bulk of the conversations we have with ourselves happen in the form of questions. Most of the things that we tell ourselves in question form. Like from the moment we open our eyes, what day is it? What time is it? What do I have to do today? What am I going to wear today? What am I going to have for breakfast? Is it going to rain? And we keep asking ourselves question after question after question. And that is the preferred mode we use to talk to ourselves. So if we can ask ourselves better questions, we will automatically, almost by default, slip into a different type of interaction and a different type of experience with ourselves, with our brain, and with the way we talk to ourselves. And it's going to alter the way we do things. So one quick thing, one quick tip when it comes to questions. Why questions tend to not help anybody. Why am I so stupid? Why do these things always happen to me? Why is it always so horrible? Why is it so hard? Why? Those why questions, they just send you on a spiral that you're not going to be able to get out of easily. And they don't serve you or anybody around you. What and how questions are a lot more empowering, right? What and how questions, and how to a certain extent, but we can talk about that later. But what and how questions, what can I do to get out of this? How can I do this differently? What can I learn from this experience? What could I have done that would have changed the outcome? What is it? What is something that I can learn from this, right? So when we ask what and how questions, or simply more empowering, more meaningful, more productive questions, we're going to see a tremendous shift in our lives and in the way we operate, right? So just to recap, we operate for the most part in this hypnotic rhythm that just follows the programming that we got even before we were able to be aware or do anything about it, right? And 95% of our thoughts are repetitive and 80% of our thoughts are negative. So that is, if that is not an indication of the fact that we need to take control of our thoughts, I don't know what is. And the way we take control of our thoughts is by focusing on the way we talk to ourselves, the conversations we have with ourselves, the way we get out of all of these things, all these negative thoughts, this repetitive drift, right? This hypnotic rhythm is by first taking a stand, which means stop and become aware of your thoughts. Name them, identify them. Do the exercise of trying to figure out when you first were exposed to those thoughts and what was happening around you when you first accepted those thoughts, right? The second thing is question all your thoughts. Don't take your thoughts at face value. Don't believe everything you think. Question it all. Make sure that you're making progressive progress in reframing those thoughts once you identify the fact that they're not true. And then finally, ask yourself better, higher quality questions that are going to propel you forward instead of pulling you in a downward spiral of thinking things that don't serve you. All right. Well, I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope this has been impactful for you. If it has, share it with someone in your life that you know can find value in it and that can be helped by it. And in the meantime, head on over to marciamaro.com and set up a 30-minute path-paving conversation where we can talk about your thoughts, your plans, everything that you're trying to create in your life, how to bring all the elements in your life together so that you live in integrity, knowing that the whole of your life is moving in the same direction where you don't have to sacrifice one part of your life in order to be successful in another. I look forward to helping you create a plan to move forward and to do the thing that you know you were called to do, help you rediscover your calling, help you move forward boldly, and help you live the authentic, valuable, intense, immense life that you were created to have and to serve others with. So go, head on over to marciamaro.com and set up your free 30-minute call. And until I see you there, I will see you next week here on Sincerely Speaking. Have a great time.